Hello everybody, Instructor Glenn here for Introduction to Sociology, starting out with your next lecture for the course. So this week I would like us to talk a bit more about research ethics and research methods before delving into one of our bigger concepts of inequality and social structure. And so I want us to start out the class, the lecture for today, going briefly over Zimbardo's Stanford prison experiment, explaining why this is a great case study for why research ethics is so essential today and why we have institutional review boards to monitor the ethics of research. And then to kind of dovetail into the next subject, which is research methods, specifically the two main types of methods that we talk about in sociology, qualitative methods and quantitative methods. Okay, so settle in, get your drink, your coffee, your snack, take notes if you would like, and I'll give you a moment to take care of all that. Okay, so again, we discussed last week about the Stanford prison experiment that was led by the Stanford psychologist, Dr. Philip Zimbardo. And you watched the film Quiet Rage that was narrated by Dr. Zimbardo about this very controversial experiment on the students of the Stanford College at the time. And so just a brief recap of that experiment. For that experiment, Dr. Zimbardo cordoned off a whole section of the psychology department at Stanford and essentially flipped a coin for a number of college students who chose to participate in the study for $15 an hour. And if the coin came up heads or tails, it determined whether or not the students in the study would be guards in the simulated prison or whether they would be prisoners in the simulated prison. And so the study was originally supposed to last 2 weeks. And as they discussed in the film that I had you watch last week, the study actually had to be ended after 6 days because everyone in the study got so involved in their roles, it became a very abusive and very disturbingly similar simulation of prison life. Everyone kind of forgot that they were actually in a psychology department in an Ivy League college. And so what that study has taught us, it's taught us many things. One of the more empirical or strictly kind of knowledge-based lessons that it's taught us is that when people are put in total institutions with authority one over the other, they're capable of going to great lengths to exert that authority and to create a situation of complete control, as the guards did in the Stanford prison experiment. And another thing that it taught us was that people who are subjects of that complete control, so the prisoners in that experiment, or the college students who were taking the role of prisoners, often lose their identities to the prison simulation, or in real life prison, to the real life prison context fairly quickly. Now, another thing that that study taught us was that it is absolutely necessary for an objective third party to monitor the ethics of research that is conducted, because a great deal of harm was done to the subjects of the Stanford prison experiment, as was shown in the documentary Quiet Rage. And so the guards that had that happen to them in the prison experiment, they realized and had to live with the knowledge for the rest of their lives that they were capable of terrible things and extreme levels of torture to exert control over other people who were, prior to the experiment, their peers, other college students. And the prisoners in the experiment also had to come to bear with the knowledge that they had been the subject of this terrorizing experiment in which they were not allowed to leave. And so they lived with the scars of that for the rest of their lives as well. So the research ethics kind of, moral of that story is that we really need to have an objective third party observing, reviewing, and otherwise monitoring the ethicality of research to make sure that we are protecting against the few main forms of harm. What are the main forms of harm that modern institutional review boards that exist at most colleges and research institutions today protect against? Physical harm. So, research that is conducted by social but also natural scientists in these institutions must not exert physical harm over the people in their studies, over the subjects of their research. Physical harm can include any kind of medical tests that change the physical state of the individual, any kind of situation the individual is put in which they may be subject to any kind of harm to their body. And so physical harm is absolutely a no-no in all social science research today. The second form of harm that institutional review boards, or I'm going to call them IRBs from now on, protect against is financial harm. And so financial harm should not be visited upon subjects as a result of participation in a research study. And so an example of this can be from the tea room trade Lord Humphrey study that you read about for last week, because the subjects of that study ultimately lost their jobs and their livelihood, a lot of them did, as a result of being outed as closeted gay men in their very small communities as a result of Lord Humphrey's study. And so they were impacted not only socially and psychologically by the work, but they were also impacted financially because it caused them to lose their jobs. And so financial harm is another form of harm that should never be visited upon the subjects of human subject research. A third form of harm that IRB seeks to prevent against is emotional harm or psychological harm. And so this type of harm is similar to the harm that was visited upon the inmates of the Stanford prison experiment. And this can range from any kind of taunting like they experienced to any kind of being put in a difficult situation in which they're forced to make a difficult choice that then they have to live with for the rest of their lives. So, for example, the Stanley Milgram shock experiment is a good example of a study that emotional or mental or psychological harm was visited upon those individuals in the study, because the people who were involved as subjects of that research truly believed in the moment of the research that they were delivering shocks to the people who were answering the questions incorrectly. And so the teachers, the people who were asking the questions and responsible for delivering the shocks for incorrect answers, truly believed that when those questions were answered incorrectly by the learners, who were actually actors, right? But they didn't know that. So they truly believed that when that happened, they were actually torturing someone, and they were being essentially forced to do so by the researcher in the study. And so that really visited upon them a sense of emotional pathos, because it made them realize that they were capable of delivering the highest shock possible to the individual on the other end that could have possibly even killed that person simply because someone told them to. A lot of people think that they can resist the effects of authority and not conform to the group or what the person in charge is saying. But what that study showed us, the Milgram shock experiment, was that actually most people, so 65% of the people in the study, most people do what they're told, even if it means hurting other people. And again, a lot of these studies that we've been discussing, the Milgram shock experiment and the Stanford prison experiment, were following on the heels of what was perhaps one of the most psychologically traumatizing and most wide-scale events in human history. Do you know which one I'm talking about? Right, the Holocaust and World War II. So Stanley Milgram particularly really wanted to understand what was it that turned ordinary German citizens into Nazi soldiers willing to torture and even kill their Jewish neighbors and counterparts. This was a moment in history that significantly traumatized whole generations of people. And so a lot of researchers wanted to understand that. But in so doing, without IRB and without modern research ethics, they ended up traumatizing more people, unfortunately, as a result of their research. So, social scientists and researchers and people often have an insatiable curiosity to understand social life, but they often need an objective third party to come in and say, listen, we need to make sure that this is going to be safe and this isn't going to hurt anyone as a result of trying to find those answers. And there is certainly IRB protocol for natural researchers as well in the biological sciences, in the chemistry fields, and for every field that does original research. But because this is a sociology class, that's why I'm focusing primarily on social science research. And so those are the types of harm that can be visited on people as a result of research without firm grasp on research ethics and supervision from an institutional review board. So to summarize, those types of harm are physical harm, financial harm, and psychological harm, which I also called mental or emotional harm. And modern IRB boards seek to prevent that type of harm.